Thanks to Alicia Gunther and Joe Bourne for allowing us to have a remote audience through Twitter. And we will hopefully be able to have last week's and this week's presentation up on YouTube by the weekend. We had a little glitch last week, but the first one is up, and we hope to have the second and third up by the weekend, so you can binge watch Tuesday topics over the weekend if you'd like to. And our series will continue, even though we're completing the mini-series on photonics. Next week we'll have Heidi Zimmer-Meyer here from Downtown Development, and she's going to talk about downtown in the next decade. All of this housing that we're hearing about, let's find out a little bit more about that and how we anticipate sustaining that growth. So for today, completing our photonics series, looking at the future, is Dr. Kent Gardner. Kent's public policy expertise ranges from public finance and public administration to healthcare and education reform. Kent joined the Center for Governmental Research in 1991 as the Director of Economic Analysis and served as president from 2005 to 2012. He's currently CGR's principal and chief economist. He connects policy action and program expenditures to their social, fiscal, and economic impacts. He leads all of CGR's economic impact assessments and contributes to program evaluations. As both an economist and a statistician, he brings a nuanced understanding of the causes and a deep appreciation both for the potential value and the limitations of established data sets and survey data. Prior to joining CGR, Kent was an associate professor of economics at SUNY Potsdam. He teaches health policy at RIT and is a regular columnist for the Rochester Business Journal. Dr. Gardner holds a BA, MA, and PhD degrees from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kent Gardner to the podium.
Thank you, Rebecca. There we go. So the question I was asked is to talk about what photonics means for the future, and kind of the shorter answer is, I don't know. You're going to be treated to 42 slides of elaborating on why I don't know, and how I might be wrong about that. So let's see what we can learn. The obligatory slide of another picture of George Eastman. We've been around for a long time. We just celebrated our 100th anniversary at the Center for Governmental Research. But we do a lot of work around the state and increasingly in other states. This certain issue, because of the impact potential import for Rochester, is near and dear to our hearts. So first, let's just get a quick sense of how the economy's doing. We know that GDP has been steadily increasing, not at the rate we'd like since 2009. We know that total employment nationally has rebounded, also has rebounded in New York State. Now in this case, you can see we've got two different axes, one for New York on the right and one for the US on the left. That doesn't work so well when you've got three municipalities or three regions to look at. So when I add Rochester, I'm indexing this. So everything starts at 2000, that's the United States, that's US, the state, and then there's Rochester. So the thing to notice about Rochester is that we had a kind of a rough time in the noughts. We saw a more significant decline than the state, much more significant decline than the nation as a whole. And I think most of you understand why that happened. While Kodak's employment was shrinking throughout the 90s, much of that was really outsourcing. So it was really moving the jobs around so much as an absolute loss in jobs. Now, as soon as digital took over and kind of pushed silver halide off the cliff in 2000, 2001, 2002, we started to see much more significant job losses. And we have recovered since the recession. You can take a look, but still have not gotten back to the level of employment we had in 2000. U.S. manufacturing, we've seen stories about U.S. manufacturing rebounding. Rebounding, that's probably a little enthusiastic. As you see that curve, it's a slight increase. We'll take it. It's the best we're going to get, I think. What generally happens in a recession is that manufacturers figure out how to make do. They figure out how to do more with less. And after a recession, we never see manufacturing jobs go back to where they were before. New York State has followed pretty much the same pattern, although you don't see it that tip up yet. Once again, we switch to adding Rochester. We go to an index, the index based on 2000. There's New York State. You can see the national number, about 70% of 2000 employment, manufacturing about 70% of employment in 2000. New York State down about 60%. Then when we add Rochester, we'll see that Rochester manufacturing employment is about 55% of what it was back in 2000. Now, part of that isn't all for bad reasons. We had a very deep dependence on manufacturing in Rochester, and we still do. New York had a deep dependence on manufacturing, and to a lesser extent still does. So that we were a big target, and so it's not surprising we would see more loss in manufacturing than other parts of the country. But this chart really is what drove the Obama administration to establish this new initiative, NNMI, the National Network of Manufacturing Innovation, NNMI. I have a tough time saying that twice in a row. That's the goal, is we know that we've lost manufacturing jobs and we'd like them back. Why do we want them back? Well, because manufacturing jobs historically have been good jobs. They pay well. They're at stable, large companies. And, we kind of want to go back to the glory days of 1955 or 1960, when there was a very substantial share of the American workforce in manufacturing, earning good pay for what was often semi-skilled employment. I have to tell you that those days are never coming back. So one of the things that the NNMI initiative can't do, really, is bring us back to 1955. We'll talk more about that in a bit. The unemployment rate has also been declining steadily. Rochester, we're down to about 5.2% for our unemployment rate. That's really good news. We know that there are still many people who are underemployed or unemployed in our community, in the state, and in the nation. So even though that number looks pretty good, we know that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to really make our economy strong. And you can tell that in the wage numbers, because despite the fact that the unemployment rate has gone down, we've not seen any wage growth. Wages are really, really stuck where they were. And generally, economists would have argued 20 years ago, as soon as you get down to a 5% unemployment rate, you're going to see a lot of pressure on wages. So the fact that we don't have that pressure on wages tells us that the structure of the labor market has changed in some really fundamental ways. Now, I want to take a look at job growth since 2000 for each of the metros in the state of New York. Oh, what happened to that? Well, hang on a second. So what didn't get named? Oh, it's Syracuse. Yeah, I don't know how Syracuse's name got popped off of there. But you can see, again, you can think about these things in percentage terms. So you look at the top line, the black line, that's Albany. Of these metros, Albany had growth at about 108% of what it had, total employment about 108% of what it had in the year 2000. Rochester were still a little under 100. Remember from the earlier slide that we know the total employment in Rochester still hasn't gone back to the level it was in 2000. And of course, we know that with the Buffalo Billion, that the Buffalo is way outperforming Rochester. You can see it at 101% of its 2000 employment, and poor Binghamton down there on the bottom. Now, what's missing from this chart? New York City. New York City, not only New York City, but lower Westchester Valley. So let's take a look at those numbers. And the reason I left them off is because they mess up my chart. Once again, I lost the name. That's Orange, Rockland, and Westchester counties on that very top. They were at 127% of their employment in 2000. So the only way you can read the rest of the chart is to kind of do these guys separately. New York City at about 116%. So downstate historically has way outperformed upstate. And that's, of course, because they've got so much manufacturing in New York City and in lower Westchester. Well, no, actually they don't, do they? So let me just point out that the success of those downstate economies isn't built on a manufacturing renaissance. It's been built on a renaissance in other sectors, particularly financial services in New York City. There are lots of great jobs outside of manufacturing. There's this myth that says that the only good jobs are manufacturing jobs, and it's just not true. A lot of wonderful jobs in the service sector, and jobs that have significant consequences for the rest of the economy. So we don't need to worry that we don't have manufacturing jobs. That's not to say that the manufacturing emphasis of this initiative is wrong-headed, but just to point out that manufacturing isn't the only place you find good jobs or job growth. Looking at New York State metros in a recent context, this is just over the last year, you'll see that all the New York State metros, which are in blue, are down towards the middle of the pack. Top of the heap is San Jose again. Austin, Texas, where my kids live, 4% growth over 1 year. 4% growth over a single year. It's really tremendous. Buffalo at 1.2%, again, that Buffalo billion, and Rochester at 0.8%. I'm sorry, this chart, in terms of ranking, Rochester, Syracuse, Albany really, in the middle, and poor Binghamton down there, really near the bottom of the heap for all metros nationwide. New York State, 10th among the largest states, 23rd among all states, 1.6% growth over the last year. All right, so let's go look at this NNMI logic model. Why do we think this could work? What is the governor thinking? What's the legislature thinking? What's the what's Congress thinking? What's Barack Obama thinking by pushing the NNMI initiative, specifically AIM Photonics here in Rochester? So that leads us to back up and ask, what confers a competitive advantage to a regional economy? What makes one economy more successful than another? We all want to be Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is kind of the ultimate, it's the standard that we all look to. We all want to be that successful. We all want to have an economy that is that dynamic over a really long period of time. So what's that require? If you go back in economic history, this has been discussed in lots of different ways. You go all the way back to 1890 and Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall called these agglomeration economies. It says when you get a lot of companies together that are attempting to do similar things, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Now, in 1990, Michael Porter from Harvard Business School published a book in which he just called these clusters. It's really the same concept that Alfred Marshall had. More recently, the buzzword is to talk about this as an ecosystem. We're going to have an innovation ecosystem. And they all mean pretty much the same thing. First, that perhaps a cluster is founded because you've got a cost advantage, driven by locational advantage, access to markets. For example, why were we the flower city at one point? F-L-O-U-R, that flower. Anybody know why we were the flower city? Grain, yeah, what about the grain? Oh, I know, you're telling me why we made flour. Why did we make flour, though? Yes, we made flour, so that's why we're the... River transportation, that's right. It's a transportation issue that really made the difference. They were growing the grain out in the Midwest. It was coming through the canal systems and came through the Great Lakes, and it landed here, and from here it was going to go to markets. If you ever looked at a big pile of wheat, the amount of flour you get out of a big pile of wheat is a lot smaller and a lot less bulky than the wheat. So you churn the wheat into flour, and then you ship it on. So we were a transshipment point. That's why it wasn't because we had a lot of grain. It was because we were the place that the grain ended up. It got milled here, and then it got shipped to markets. So a lot of clusters occur because of those locational advantages. Or you've got a concentration of a particular type of skill. You've got access to another kind of input. You've got maybe cheap electricity. Or you've got shared expertise. Shared expertise defines a lot of these clusters. You've got a rich supply chain, which is really similar thing. The supplier firms, that you have supplier firms that bring what those final product firms really need. Educational resources, access to critical technology. So, one of the examples that Porter brings is the California wine cluster. You've got everything you need in California, Northern California, to produce wine. And the first thing you needed was the climate. But you need lots of other things to be really successful. To be that big, to be that dominant in industry, you need a lot of things to come together. That's what creates a cluster. So the question is are successful clusters born or are they made? There have been lots of attempts to imitate Silicon Valley. I mean, just loads and loads of them if you look around. Now, this guy at Kauffman Foundation, Yasuki Motoyama, suggests that clusters exist. He says, okay, we can prove that clusters exist, but that doesn't mean that governments can create one. And that's kind of the question we struggle with here. Or you've got Vivek Wadhwa at Stanford, who says Porter, Legions of Consultants prescribe top-down clusters to governments all over the world. After Porter's book came out, he formed a consultancy, and he and his consultants were in really hot demand. I assume they still do some of that kind of work. But Wadhwa says, hundreds of regions collectively spent tens of billions of dollars trying to replicate Silicon Valley. I don't know of a single success, he says, in 2013. Now, that's maybe a kind of a cynical perspective. And I don't think I don't subscribe to that level of skepticism. For example, what about Albany Nano, SUNY Polytechnic? Is this the exception that proves the rule? This is what we call a socialized factory model. Chip development is really, 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 really expensive. And so what Albany Nano does is they built a lab, so they've got this massive lab with extraordinarily expensive equipment, and they lease this out to companies that want to do research, want to do prototype development, want to develop their own technology within their facility. And it's been pretty successful. They've attracted a lot of innovation. They've attracted a lot of companies, 250 companies at their count. And private investment has come to Albany Nano. But this is one of my points. One of the reasons it's come to Albany Nano is because of the indefatigable salesmanship of Elaine Calleros. Calleros is a quintessential salesman. And he has been very successful at persuading IBM, Tokyo Electron, and the list goes on and on and on, to make investments within Albany Nano. Would it have been possible without Elaine Calleros? I don't know. He sold Governor Cuomo. You've heard about Startup New York. Startup New York provides very significant tax incentives to anyone who locates near a university. Well, that's basically the Albany Nano model. Calleros says to the governor, listen, you want business development, you want to make that business development occur right next to universities. And so Startup New York is a reflection of that. Now, Calleros is not the most popular guy in the state of New York. Calleros is he's very flashy. He's just always out there glad-handing. A lot of the physicists kind of cringe a little bit when they go to a Calleros presentation. He is the highest-paid employee in the state of New York. This is his Ferrari, one of his Ferraris. But I have to ask you whether it would have happened without that kind of flashy, over-the-top salesmanship from Calleros. I kind of wonder. So Albany Nano, SUNY Poly is part of AIM Photonics, and I think even though it makes some people cringe, I think Calleros is part of the package, and that's probably a good thing. Now, what about the Fraunhofer Society? This is another example that people cite. 67 research institutes. They have been arguably quite successful. Now, what's interesting, officially they say that 70% of their money comes from industry, 30% comes from federal and state governments. Some people have looked at that and said, well, of that 70% that's coming from private industry, an awful lot of that money is actually coming through grants and incentives that still come from the federal and state governments in Germany. So this is still a pretty heavily subsidized operation, but it has done a lot to preserve the technological capabilities of small and mid-sized firms in Germany. This is also deeply integrated with Germany's vocational training programs. And those of you who've looked at education in Germany, I mean, the Germans track their young people. They've got a very aggressive vocational training initiative. Students maybe don't have the opportunity to do anything they want. They have to test into universities, and the Fraunhofer Society with their Fraunhofer Institutes are very much embedded in that vocational training factory apprenticeship model. And again, arguably it's been great for supporting innovation at small and mid-sized firms. Now, other people would argue that they haven't done a very good job of coming up with breakthrough innovations, that they don't have any standout companies that have come out of through the Fraunhofer system. But nonetheless, this is one model that says that you really can make a difference if you make public investment in institutions that focus on technology. So the NNMI model is the U.S. answer to the Fraunhofer Society. They describe themselves linked institutes for manufacturing. Sound familiar? Common goals, unique concentrations on specific sectors or specific clusters. And the notion is that they're going to develop technologies. The notion of lifting all ships, that's nice PR speak. I don't know how you have one focused on one area and one metro that's going to actually lift all ships, but we'll keep that definition. And we're also going to build a pipeline of talent, and that, of course, is a critical piece of it. So let's go on and talk about AIM photonics. You listened to Paul Ballantyne 2 weeks ago, and I've learned a lot from Paul. I looked at Paul's presentation and I got Paul's slides, and in fact I have borrowed a number of Paul's slides from actually a different presentation that he made for today, because I don't know the science. What's more, photonics doesn't fit into a nice little NAICS code. For those of you who know the North American Industrial Classification System, there isn't a classification for photonics because photonics spans all sorts of product codes. So the only way you actually identify the firms that are in this photonics business are to actually get on the phone and call people. And that's what Paul and his graduate students do. So I'm very reliant on Paul's numbers to talk about what's going on. So Paul points out that the centerpiece of AIM photonics is integrated photonics. We've been reading for a long time that electrons just don't move fast enough, and that if we want to continue seeing Moore's law apply and get chips faster and faster and smaller, that we've got to start using photons instead. So this is a chart that you saw 2 weeks ago if you were here. AIM photonics is firstly focused on this notion of integrated photonics, so that we're going to be able to produce chips that are faster and smaller and continue to improve the capacity of computers. Now, that isn't something that any firms in Rochester do. Now, that is what a lot of the firms at SUNY Poly in Albany do. So this is going to support what they are doing. Rochester's contribution is expected to be in testing and in packaging. We got this fabulous packaging cluster here in Rochester. You wouldn't think of that as being a significant employment sector, but we know a lot about packaging. Seems kind of odd, but it's a really important part of what we do in the economy. And then new sensors. But we don't actually do integrated photonics. Incidentally, I can't resist a little aside. In the future, if you listen to politicians talk, most jobs are going to be in new industries and new technology. That is frankly not true. Most jobs are going to be in companies that already exist, and they're going to be in products that already exist and services that already exist in kind of boring sectors. Ask Warren Buffett. You don't see a lot of technology in Warren Buffett's portfolio. He invests in really boring stuff, and he's done okay. So the point is that the technology will go through all sectors. So I think sometimes we need to be careful not to listen to the siren song of a new product or a brand new technology, but recognize that effective economic growth is going to depend on continuing to doing the things that we do already and doing them better, and making use of technology to improve the capacity of our throughput. Okay, so again, these are Paul's slides. These are Paul's numbers, because and I don't have a capacity to pull those numbers. He's done this with some really tedious work on the phone with both Paul himself and his graduate students. In optics, photonics, and imaging, which is, again, not integrated photonics, if you kind of kept up with him 2 weeks ago. 120 companies, 15,000 employees, serving lots of different product markets. separating out the product market from the technology is sometimes a little difficult. But these are the product markets into which we are selling, these photonics firms are selling their wares. And again, you look at the way these things work. It's a very nice little exercise that Paul did here, trying to take those companies and putting them into their various functions within the innovation ecosystem, or in Porter's terms, in terms of the photonics cluster. So if you take a look at the number of employees, the OEM companies are the ones that put everything together. And one of the points that a lot of people have made, a lot of good research at RIT over the years, has focused on the fact that we have lost employment at those big companies that coordinate the supply chain. So by losing Kodak as a major company in Rochester, we have lost a company that used to coordinate the technology and the training and all the marketing, all the various pieces of going to being a successful business on behalf of its supplier firms. Xerox used to do that as well. Bausch & Lomb used to do that. General Motors used to do that. The list goes on. And because many of those firms have really changed their focus or have gotten much, much smaller, we've lost that capacity. So those OEM system companies are really very significant. And it's the loss of those OEM systems companies that has made it necessary, I think, for us to create institutions like the AIM Photonics, because there needs to be some more coordination on behalf of those supplier firms. Again, most of our firms tend to be relatively small. We have far fewer big firms than we used to. The average size firm in Rochester has gone down quite a bit. Even though our employment numbers have more or less held up, we've had some shrinkage, but it's not been dramatic. At the same time, the average size of firms in Rochester has gone down. We also have a fabulous training infrastructure. That's the other thing that makes it possible for us to do the kinds of things that we talk about for AIM Photonics, or for the optics, photonics, and imaging cluster that Paul talked about 2 weeks ago. And that educational infrastructure, all the way from your vocational training, all the way through to doctoral training at U of R and RIT, is really important to our success. And again, these things are interrelated. There's lots of different technologies that support each other, but it's not the same technology. So we talk about photonics, talk about integrated photonics, optics, imaging, and sensing. These are all, to some degree, separable components, and all will contribute, I think, to the growth of the Rochester economy. Okay, so what's it going to bring? Again, as I said at the beginning, we really don't know. The economic development isn't like a machine where you put a quarter in the front and you get a candy bar out the bottom. You can't make a specific investment and be confident that it's going to turn into jobs. You'd like to believe that when you listen to our elected officials, but frankly, that's just not the way it works. A lot of what happens in economic development is a function of good luck. Sometimes it's having the right people. As I say, I think SUNY Poly's success is, I think, to a significant degree attributable to very successful salesmanship on the part of Kalliaras. I don't know whether he's a good physicist. I don't think it matters. He's a good salesman, and that's what's really mattered in this case. The whole notion of industrial policy is also controversial. A lot of economists would argue that when this gets to picking winners and losers, that the public sector is pretty bad at it. And historically, I think we've seen a lot of failures where Congress or the executive branch have poured a lot of money into a new initiative and not have it turn into much. You folks remember the Infotonics Center out in Canandaigua? That kind of was really limping close to closure. SUNY Poly bought it and or acquired it, and so Kalliaras and his folks have been able to make use of it. But that was an example of a lot of money and a lot of initiative that went into something that really never created much in the way of job creation. So in Rochester, the fact that we have the science is undeniable. Connecting discovery to product development isn't a certain thing. So we've got the science, we've got the facilities, we've got the expertise. It doesn't all necessarily mean that things are going to are going to expand. Now, every university, with a decent-sized engineering program, or physics program, has a photonics initiative. We are not alone. But I talked to a friend of mine who knows the national market, international market, and he suggested that we're in the top 4. University of Central Florida and Orlando, believe it or not, is one. Arizona, New Mexico, and UC Santa Cruz. That these are places that, these are the top places in photonics, and we're one of them. So we really do bring a lot to the party. But let me take us back to 1983. Anytime you start talking about industrial policy, you have to think about Japan. Back in 1983, we were all afraid that this is going to be the Japanese century, and that New York, I'm sorry, that the United States was doomed to economic oblivion because the Japanese were just so good at figuring out what was next. And of course, you know what's happened subsequent to that. So might work, might not. A couple of other cautions. You know, I get nervous when we see politicians making decisions about economic events. Congress is probably going to want a chicken in every pot. The other thing is that manufacturing continues to evolve. As I said earlier, just because you have a manufacturing initiative doesn't mean that's going to come with a lot of jobs. Manufacturers have gotten more and more efficient about selling their products without a lot of people. World Economic Forum just released a survey that they did of 15 industrialized countries where they're predicting a job loss from 2015 to 2020 of about 5 million jobs. $7 million. I'm sorry. In any event, the point that they were making is that technology is making a lot of occupations obsolete, that is so we're sailing into a headwind here with technology. So the emphasis on manufacturing sounds good, but it may not really get anywhere. So AI and photonics and the optics, photonics, and imaging focus is a great place for Rochester to be. We've got tremendous assets on which to build, but what it really means for the future is going to depend on how all that is executed, and that'll be up to the folks who are leading the initiative. So Rebecca, we have time for questions. You were first up. Go. Yeah.
I saw the squabble this past summer over the location of the photonics business, and it's deeper in the just footage has been the part of the owners of our largest downtown building to build up their structures. The Chase building at 50% vacancy, Birmingham Boucher Mountain at 50% vacancy, and Sibley at 70% vacancy. I welcome the trend to downtown business and living, and I'm almost done, but it's a trend and not a tsunami. What do you see as the future for this level of downtown space? And has any thought been given perhaps enclosure of some of these large vertical ghost towns?
So the question is about our large vertical ghost towns in downtown Rochester. Partly I'll just defer to Heidi Zimmermeyer next week. That's an easy way to pitch that question off. But I think that one of the important points to make is that we as the taxpayers don't actually own those places. Galena bought Chase Tower. They're renaming it the Metropolitan, and they're pouring a lot of money into renovating it, largely for residential. Morgan and Glazer bought the Bausch & Lomb building, now called Legacy Tower. It's a beautiful building, and they seem to think they can make a buck there. They're also working on Midtown. There's just a lot of private money going into those, as you call them, vertical ghost towns. I'm encouraged by that. I think if we were trying to develop them as a public sector, if it was the city of Rochester building those buildings and renovating those buildings, I'd agree with you. But I think the fact that we got private money going into it leads me to believe that these smart developers, believe that they can fill those buildings. So I'm actually quite encouraged by that. Yeah, so the question is about the whole management conversation that Christopher Brooks and David Riley talked about last week. I don't have an answer for that. I think management by committee is often is a disaster, and I think for those of you who've been part of committees in the past, you know that committees that are really effective are ones where leadership emerges, and the leadership is given the authority to make the decisions that are needed to make the initiative successful. So it's not that we can have this and just kind of anoint a single individual to run it. That wouldn't make any sense. But there's a certain storming and norming sort of process that goes on, I think, with any kind of new group effort. And this is a group effort. There are a lot of people, a lot of institutions that bring a lot to the party. We want them to be part of this. And it's going to take some time, I think, for that all to work itself out. So it's not surprising. Anytime you've got this kind of money at play, and the future of a lot of institutions really rides on how successful this is. So people want to make sure that they get their oar in. And I'm confident that folks will work it out. It's not a lot of fun to watch, but it isn't surprising. I don't think it's unusual. And in my experience, usually these things do get worked out. And we just have to wait and see what comes out.
Yeah, I think one of the numbers I saw was 10,000 new jobs coming to the area. You know where that number comes from and what assumptions they were making us come up with it?
You didn't see me come up with any job numbers, did you? Well, that's good reason for that. I have the faintest idea where those numbers came from. In all seriousness, this is really big. This could be huge. On the other hand, it could be nothing. I don't think it'll be nothing. But any kind of numbers that anybody attaches to this thing are completely speculative. Yeah.
My question is, where there is some deficiency, the way that my limited understanding is in the healthcare industry. There's a lot of wasted processes and this thing. So is there any initiative to connect healthcare to photonics?
Question is there a connection between healthcare and photonics? Well, the only thing I'd point out is, one of the things that Paul talked about is the biosensors as a piece of all of this. We have a lot of companies in Rochester, you think about Vaccinex, for example, and some other companies that do some work around the bio side. And I would think that if there's an opportunity that hopefully those synergies would emerge. I don't think that healthcare is an explicit focus of this. But keeping U of R involved, I don't think U of R does a lot without paying attention to the the healthcare components of it. Yeah.
You didn't say anything about the DOD's popular success. And I'm wondering, the companies that you mentioned in Rochester that have expertise in testing, packaging, and new sensors, what impact will that have manufacturing products for the military industrial complex, for the popular defense, what they call mil specs, military specifications? Look different than going to Walmart or Target and buying something off the shelf. For example, if I were a pilot on a naval aircraft, they were ready to land my fighter jet on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, I would want to know that hook is going to stop me. My fuselage would have to be reinforced, not like landing in Monroe County Airport. So will these companies that you talked about, will they be able to make products in that military specification environment?
Yeah, the question is about military contracts, and I know that the opinion cuts both ways on this, right? On the one hand, I mean, there's a thread in all of us that say, well, we don't want to have anything to do with the military-industrial complex. We want to kind of stay a long ways away from that. The flip side, the economist response would be to say that the military funds an awful lot of stuff, an awful lot of research that we have all benefited from. You were talking specifically about aircraft. And I suspect that an awful lot of the innovations that go into some of the newest airliners that we see out there really came originally from military contracts. So you would hope that there would be a good vehicle to transmit that education, what we learn from the military contracts into consumer products. But I don't know anything about that other than that. So just a general statement. But I understand your concern. Yeah. Oh, come on, John. How large could it be? Well, think about Eastman Kodak. How large was Eastman Kodak? At its peak, it was 60,000 workers. And arguably, I think if you look at the numbers, you look at Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, back around the mid-1980s, they were half of the economy at that point. Half of the Rochester economy in 3 companies. Now, that's not necessarily a healthy place to be. I'm much happier with lots of small companies than I am with a couple of big ones. But yeah, we haven't the faintest idea. Who knew that Apple would become the behemoth it's become? Although, let me point out that relative to its market capitalization, they hardly employ anybody, which is kind of astonishing, right? And that's been true of a lot of new technology companies that don't tend to be big employers. Google employs very few people. Relative to their market capitalization, again, they don't employ anybody. It's really kind of remarkable. Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit, because it seems like there's a paradox. On one hand, a metric going forward to measure the success of jobs, and yet through the automation and other things, we're seeing that some of the success is going to create a lot of jobs. So, are there other metrics we should be looking at? And what are they?
Yeah, the question is whether jobs is a good metric. I had an engagement some years ago to evaluate the Economic Development Omnibus Economic Development Act of 1987, I think it was, and one of the programs within the Omnibus Act was a program intended to improve the productivity of manufacturing, and yet when I was given my standards, to evaluate these very individual programs, I was told to use jobs. Well, that particular program was intended to destroy jobs. If you're going to improve the productivity of manufacturing, that means you're going to use fewer people. So it's a kind of a schizophrenia that we've had in economic development circles for a really long time. We'd like to think, the workaround, kind of the mental workaround, is to say that if a company is more productive and they use fewer people to produce the same amount of goods, then they'll produce even more goods, and therefore they'll employ more people, fewer people per good, but still they'll employ more people in general. So we'd like to think that would happen. But yeah, and I do think we need a better set of metrics. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about well-being, and well-being does come down to job creation. So, you, sir?
One of your slides mentioned about how all these top-down initiatives, consultants come in at billions of dollars and spend, there hasn't been any success. So, is anybody paying attention to what went wrong in those situations so we're not on the same path?
Yeah, the question is whether, when folks take a look, it was Vivek Wadhwa that pointed out that he's seen a lot of these things and a lot of money spent and hasn't seen a lot of success. I do think that there's a post-mortem process that happens with every one of them. I've looked at a lot of those. The problem is that, the failures are all, pretty much unique. They all fail in their own spectacular way. And it's hard, I think, to draw a lot of conclusions, but there's certainly some you can draw. I do think that a lot of people who are part of this initiative are aware of some of those challenges and are working on them. But it's not easy to dissect why it wasn't successful. These are really hard things to pull off. That's the thing. This isn't automatic. This is really hard to do well. Yeah. Well, one of the interesting questions when I asked my friend David Hochman, who's a technology consultant, he's the guy who came up with my list, UC Santa Cruz and University of Central Florida and the folks in Arizona and New Mexico. And I said, well, what about international competition? He says, well, actually in photonics, while every major country has an investment in photonics and is doing work in photonics, frankly, the United States is way ahead of the competition internationally. So at least his assessment is that we're really in a pretty well positioned in the United States to be effective in this area. And given we're one of 4 here in Rochester, I think that's great. You know, good. That's good news. One more, Peter. Political synergies. Tell me more.
What's going on in Congress, what's going on in the executive branch, and things that align seem to help with this.
You know, politics, of course, never plays a role in these kinds of programs. I mean, think about the economic development consequences of the Iowa caucuses, for example, given that that's coming up. For those of you who faithfully watched West Wing, there's a wonderful episode of West Wing where the candidates are talking about whether they're going to take the pledge in Iowa, because and this was a long time ago. I know this. This is a pet topic of mine. So I know this episode aired in 1999. And the candidates are all saying among themselves, of course this is Aaron Sorkin's view, but still that we all know that this is a really stupid program and that we shouldn't be subsidizing corn farmers to make ethanol, and yet it's really politically popular, and so we're going to support it anyway. So the politics is usually negative in my view, Peter. I don't see. I think that often, again, talk about NNMI. We've got a relatively small number of these NNMI institutes now, but every senator and every congressman is going to be saying, hey, what about Kansas? There isn't one in Idaho. Well, what about Mississippi? And before long, we're going to see one in every state. And and then we'll dilute the impact. If it's a good idea, then we should be doing it very carefully in a very focused way, not have one in every state. So.
Thank you very much. And Kent has agreed to stay a little bit longer. If you have questions, you want to come forward. I appreciate all of our speakers and their willingness to share slides and work together. Christopher Brooks, David Riley, Paul Ballantine, and of course Kent Gardner. And please join us next week as we continue a discussion about downtown. Questions came up today, and Heidi Zimmermeyer will answer those and more.